Welcome back. Years ago I built this router table, and you can see that it's based on the Norm Abram design. It had a bench dog, heavy duty lift in it, and the Porta Cable 7518 motor, rockler top, and a rockler fence. Storage for all my bits and dust collection. Great router table, I loved it, but it took up a lot of space in my garage. This is a 20 by 22 foot garage. And I always wanted to put it in my table saw, but because I was working at the time, I could only work on it sporadically, and if I had something come up where I needed a router table, well, it would be in pieces. So a year ago, we got a text from a friend whose father was going into assisted living, and he was having an estate sale to sell off what was in the house to include his workshop. Send pictures. He sent us pictures. I looked at them. I saw the router table, and I said, I think I recognize those parts. Offered him $200 for the router table. If that was not equitable, we could negotiate. So I left it open. Got there. He accepted the $200, threw it in the truck, and brought it home. Turns out the router table had the Jessem phenolic heavy-duty table top, had the Jessem extruded aluminum fence with dust collection, a Jessem master lift, older version of it, one of the first versions of it, master lift, with the same 7518 Porta Cable motor in it. Priced those up. I think I did pretty good. So now I had the opportunity to put a router table in my table saw, but still have a router table if I needed it. So that's what this video is about, is taking those parts and mounting them in the table saw. Now, as far as the tabletop is concerned, it is hung out over the rails. So I had to trim it down to fit in the rails, then I had to trim it again to have the slot rails fit in between the table saw rails in order to put in the router fence. Because normally this would be sitting on a tabletop and you just slide the fence in, but the rails were outside the router fence, the router table. I had to mount them more inside. You'll see in the video what I'm talking about. As to my old router table, one of my good friends who's now getting into woodworking, he bought that, and he's now mounting all that gear in his setup at his shop. So let's get on with putting all this gear into my table saw. Okay, so you've seen that I've notched out either side, cut out either side of the fence cut it from with the top side up so I prevent chipping on the melamine. This is the bracket for the fence. There is a nut screw, a tightener that goes here and slides back and forth. These will sit here and here, so it's got the same width. Now, this phenolic taps phenomenally. It's all these holes you see here are tapped 1032, and it holds screws very well. So I'll drill and tap these 1032 to hold them in place. Then, what I have to do is route out a notch right about here, so when I bring the fence along this way, the nut can slide out from the bracket and I can lift the fence off. So the next step is to get those fastened in place and then route that little notch out. Okay, now I've got the rails in place for the fence. I haven't relieved the other side of this for the fence jam nut. I'll do that next. But these turned out to be all 1024, and I should have cut that immediately because this is a soft material and you're going to use 1024 or coarse threads in soft materials. So I relieved, as you saw, cut these out. I mounted these up, and now I'll show you how this fits, how it's going to sit in the table saw. Here's one of the rails for the fence, and here we have 1024 screws. These are metric, I can't remember which one they are, and an angled piece of aluminum. It fastens it to the router table, and then it sits up. You see this gap right here, and there's all these 1/4 screw holes around here that are to level the router plate once it's in place, and 2 adjustment angles to get it tight in the hole so it doesn't move around. That comes later when I put the router itself in here after the cabinet's built. This is a piece of the angle that I added because there was a little bit of bow from this thing, the way it was mounted in the original table, and it sagged over time. So that takes up the sag. I'll do another one here if I have to, but I have to make those measurements. This is the locking screw to hold the router fence in place. It has a nut on the end that slides through this track but unfortunately it was going to be stopped here, and there's no way to get it in the other side. So I routed out a section here, and what I used to do that is, of course, a jig and a pattern bit. So this just slides in here with the fence attached to it, and now you can lock the fence down wherever you want it. So here's one of the brackets. It's real simple. It's a piece of red oak picked up at the local home center, some aluminum bar stock, 1/8 inch thick, fastened to the to the oak, and this will be through screwed on the same connection points that the saw stop uses. You drill the holes in this to a half an inch, and it allows you to give you some adjustment. And I'll use larger washers behind here to give more surface area so it won't move over time. Once this is, now let me show you, get the router table top. So this will fit right in here. It'll be fastened from the bottom, just like that. Now I have to grind out, don't know if you can see that, I have to grind out here on the opposite side so that any guide I use along the miter slot can pass through the angle bracket. Got the rails in place, so I'll take the router table, and because of a bolt that holds these on, it actually has to slide over these aluminum rails like this. Oop. There we go. Now, that's it in place. I've relieved the rails, the angle iron for a miter gauge. This is higher up underneath than here. This is 3/4, this is 5/8. So, got some play in there. I've got some 3/16 aluminum coming today, as a matter of fact, so we can finish it. That'll sit underneath here to raise this up, and then I'll fine tune it with the rails that hold this in place. After that, I'll do a fastening system so it won't move, it'll stay in place and everything will be fine. So there we are, almost done. Once this is done, the next fun job is building the cabinet underneath it to hold dust collection, router bits, and router tools. So I finished it. The router table is now incorporated into the table saw wing. The fence, everything is mounted. You know, the most difficult part of doing this job was getting this adjustment here between the table saw and the fence just right, so everything slid nice and easily across it. But you've seen the top of this before and how it's set up. Now let me bring the camera over and I'll show you some of the features I've incorporated into this. The router switch is one of these standard push start paddle emergency stop switches in a box connected to a piece of plywood on the router box. I have the handle for cranking the router lift up and down, and I have a hex key here for changing router bits. I'll show you that in a minute. Now let's go into the dust collection. Dust collection blast gate comes down, have a spare piece of hose coming off of a Y, that's for the fence itself because the fence has an intake, and it scoots down and then goes underneath and back behind the router, and that's connected to my main trunk dust collection system. So underneath the router table, I built this small cabinet, cheap plywood cabinet. The top drawer has all the router bits and router accessories, so that deals with just the router. The second drawer is table saw accessories and equipment that goes for the table saw, including everybody who has a saw stop should have one of these, a spare cartridge in their shop. The lower drawer, that's got some, as you can see, it's got feather boards, instruction manuals. It's got a bunch of other little tools that we use occasionally in the shop. So that's this side of it, and that's all for storage. So let's look at how I wired this beastie up. So power cord comes in here. Power cord is here. It comes in from the power. Goes in the junction box. There's a cable coming out to the back of the router table that goes the other side in front of the table saw. I'll show you what that's about later. From the junction box, it comes into the switch, paddle switch, and then back into the box for the router itself. Now, why in the heck do I have two plugs on the power going to the front of the table saw and coming into the box? Very simply, if I need to pull that router box completely, this whole assembly out of the saw, off the saw, I just unplug those two right there and the whole thing slides right off. Router box is mounted to the table, and mounted to that box is also the start-stop paddle switch. A router set inside, a variable speed switch is very accessible, and instead of just running a wire out with a plug on it, I have put a box in and plugged the router directly into that box. That way, if I ever need to pull the router out without doing anything else, it's very easy to do. I just unplug it and pull it straight up. This is the insert that goes into the router that holds my router bits. Extreme tension, it's called. Where'd it come from? It's patent pending. Anyhow, this allows for quick change of router bits. There's a 1/4 inch insert for it as well, and you just take a hex key and tighten it up. And it's great for quick changing router bits. You don't have to go with the wrench. There's no wrenches involved, of course. The other thing about this is once I install the router in the router table and check the run out with the dial indicator, this run out is less than 5/1000ths of an inch. So it's very, very, very precise. Although with woodworking, 5/1000ths of an inch really doesn't matter. Here's what I did on the table saw, the front of the table saw. I took and attached this 3/4 inch plywood to the side of the router accessories box, and just put things on it that I use regularly, like the miter fence, feather boards, the dado plate for the saw stop, and the dado cartridge for the saw stop. Interestingly enough, when you get a saw stop, they tell you to adjust the distance from the shoe to the blade to, I had 3/32 or something like that. It happens to be the thickness of a nickel. There happened to be a little divot or void in the plywood right there where I could just stick a nickel. So I've got the nickel, and the adjustment hex key is right here. So that cleaned up a little more of my shop as well. So that's the router table move to its new location. The other router table has been sold. A good friend of mine bought it. He's setting it up in his shop right now. Now on to doing some things with the router table.